This is gonna sound like something straight out of a messed up movie, but here we go. It's been about 6 months since it all happened, and I've tried to bury it, move on, but it keeps clawing its way back to the surface every damn night. I figured sharing it here might be my only shot at shaking it off. So, rewind to about a year ago. I was going through some rough stuff, stuck in a loop where I didn't feel anything real. Nights spent on the usual social media didn't help, and I eventually wandered into darker corners online. That's where I stumbled upon her. Let's call her Evelyn, though I never got a straight name, to be honest. We met in one of those obscure, closed-off forums you'd only find if you knew where to look. It wasn't a dating site, not even close, but our conversations just clicked in a way that nothing else in my life did at that time. From day one, there was this weird electric pull between us. I could feel it through the screen, like she was right there, breathing over my shoulder. Her messages were full of mystery, humor, and this edgy darkness that hooked me. She'd talk about things that most people would run away from, morbid, twisted topics that somehow felt real, not just horror movie crap. It was clear she'd been through hell in ways I couldn't imagine, but it only made me want to know more. Weeks passed, and every night I was on there, staying up late just to catch her at her usual time. We'd talk about life, dreams, regrets, and darker stuff. She made me feel things, ugly things, twisted thoughts that should have repulsed me but didn't. I found myself drawn to the way she spoke about pain, violence, even death. She had this eerie way of making everything sound like it had a purpose, like even the darkest parts of life were leading somewhere. The first time I felt uneasy was one night when we were talking about control. She told me she liked to see how far she could push people, make them do things they'd never normally consider. I should have seen the warning lights, but by then I was too deep, too damn fascinated by her. I was so desperate to keep her attention that I played along, agreed with things I didn't actually believe in, just to see where it would go. That's when she sent me her address. It wasn't a request or an invitation. It was more like a dare, like she was testing if I'd actually show up. Her words haunted me. If you want to know what real life feels like, come find me. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was looking for a thrill or trying to break out of the grayness I was stuck in. Whatever the reason, I packed a bag, hopped in my car, and drove to that address. It was 2 states over, a crappy town with run-down buildings and cracked sidewalks. The place she lived in was barely holding together, the kind of building you'd expect to find crime tape around. When I got there, my phone buzzed. Top floor, door on the left. No name, no greeting, just instructions. I climbed up this dark, stinking staircase, feeling the walls closing in with every step. I could smell rot and mold, and the air felt thick, like something heavy was waiting for me. I almost turned back, but then I heard this low, muffled hum coming from behind her door. It was music, soft but unsettling. Something about it made my skin crawl. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. She looked smaller, more fragile than I'd imagined. Her face was pale, eyes dark and hollow, like she hadn't slept in weeks. But then she smiled, this slow, creeping smile that made me feel like she was peeling back my skin and looking straight inside. She welcomed me in, but it wasn't warm or friendly. It was like I was a specimen she'd been dying to study up close. Her apartment was as messed up as she was. There were strange symbols drawn on the walls, and every surface was covered in piles of strange objects, candles, broken mirrors, old dolls with their eyes gouged out. And in the center of it all was this knife placed carefully on a makeshift altar. It was a big, brutal-looking thing, sharp as hell and polished like it was something precious. We sat down, and she poured me a drink. It tasted weird, bitter, but I downed it anyway, hoping to steady my nerves. We talked, but it wasn't like our chats online. There was this strange tension, like she was waiting for something, watching my every reaction with those piercing eyes. At one point, she leaned forward, her face inches from mine, and whispered, "Do you believe in destiny?" I tried to laugh it off, but she just stared at me, unblinking. "No, really. Do you believe that some people are meant to meet, to hurt each other, to change each other?" It was all so intense, but part of me was addicted to the fear, the danger. I wanted her to like me, to think I was as dark as she was. So I told her yes. I told her I believed in whatever twisted fate she was hinting at. That was when she reached over, grabbed the knife from the altar, and handed it to me. "Show me," she said, voice low and almost needy. "Show me you're not afraid." I didn't know what she meant, but I was too caught up to back down. I took the knife, feeling its cold weight in my hands, and for a split second, I swear it felt like it was pulsing, alive. She guided my hand to her arm, pressing it down until the blade was touching her skin. I thought she was joking, testing me, but her expression stayed dead serious. She wanted me to cut her, to see if I'd go through with it. My hands were shaking, but she just kept whispering, egging me on, telling me to break the barrier, to leave a mark. Eventually, I pulled back, but that seemed to disappoint her. She gave me this twisted smile and muttered something about wasted potential. The night went on like that, this sick, dark dance of testing boundaries, pushing limits. I should have left then, but I couldn't. I was addicted, trapped in whatever spell she'd cast. And as the night wore on, I realized that I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I was just lost in her, in this horrifying, beautiful nightmare. When I finally crashed on her couch, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt her presence, hovering, watching, waiting. And when I woke up the next morning, she was standing over me, holding the knife. "Good morning," she said, with that same slow, unsettling smile. "Did you sleep well?" It was only later that I'd realized that from the moment I stepped into her place, I had signed myself up for something far darker than I could have ever imagined. And there was no turning back. When I woke up that morning, it felt like my mind was wrapped in fog. My head throbbed, and there was this gritty taste in my mouth, like I'd been chewing on pennies all night. I glanced around, my senses slowly crawling back, and realized I was still on her couch, in that dark, cluttered apartment. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen, but the knife was gone. That was the first thing I noticed, and it shot this eerie jolt through me. It had been right next to me when I'd finally passed out, but now, just gone. I sat up, running a hand over my face, trying to piece together everything that had happened. Flashes of the night before came back, her hollow eyes, her whispers, that damn knife pressing into her skin. Part of me wanted to leave, but the other part, the part that craved something twisted and real, wanted to stay, to dig deeper into whatever hellish mystery she was hiding. Just as I was about to get up, she appeared from the bathroom, hair damp, wrapped in a thin, almost see-through robe. She looked different in the daylight. Fragile, almost breakable. The dark shadows under her eyes were more pronounced, her cheeks hollow and her lips pale, but her gaze still had that intensity, that silent promise of something terrifyingly real. She walked over, handed me a cup of coffee without a word, and sat down on the floor in front of me, watching me drink like she was studying every move I made. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you dream last night?" The question caught me off guard. I honestly couldn't remember, but something about the way she asked made me feel like I should. I shook my head, and she let out this soft, disappointed sigh, like I'd failed some unspoken test. Then she leaned in closer, her face inches from mine, her breath warm and sweet. "I want to show you something," she murmured, her lips curling into that unsettling smile. Before I could respond, she took my hand, guiding me toward a door I hadn't noticed the night before. It was painted black, blending into the wall so seamlessly that if you weren't looking for it, you'd never even know it was there. She unlocked it with this old, rusted key that hung around her neck and pushed it open, revealing a staircase leading down into complete darkness. Something inside me screamed to turn around, to walk away, but her hand was cold and firm, pulling me down with a strange, quiet strength. The steps creaked beneath us as we descended, the air growing colder and damp, filled with this thick, musty smell that made my stomach churn. Finally, we reached the bottom, and she flicked on a dim, flickering light. The basement was worse than her apartment. Every inch of the walls was covered in scribbled symbols, strange markings that looked like they were done in red ink or something else. There were photos scattered across the floor, images of people in pain, people staring into the camera with wide, terrified eyes. And in the center of the room was an old wooden chair, bolted to the floor, with thick leather straps hanging off it. She guided me to the chair, her fingers gripping my arm so tightly that it hurt, but I didn't resist. I was too numb, too hypnotized by the horror unfolding around me. She pushed me down into the chair, strapping my wrists and ankles before stepping back to admire her work. "You're safe," she whispered, like she was trying to comfort me, though her eyes held that twisted glint. "I just need to know if you're really ready for this. If you're ready for me." I tried to laugh it off, to joke about how this was a bit much for a first date, but the words died in my throat as she pulled out the knife. The same knife from last night, only now, in the dim basement light, I could see every detail. The jagged, uneven edge, the tiny nicks along the blade, like it had been used far too many times on something or someone. She knelt down, holding the knife in front of my face, her gaze boring into mine. "This is real," she said softly. "If you want to be with me, you have to understand that. No more masks, no more pretending. This is who I am." I wanted to look away, but she grabbed my face, forcing me to meet her eyes. There was this raw, naked honesty in her gaze, like she was showing me the darkest parts of herself without a hint of shame. And as disturbing as it was, part of me felt honored, like I was the only person she'd ever let this close. She slid the knife up my arm, barely grazing the skin, but enough to send a sharp sting racing up my spine. She watched my reaction, her smile widening as she saw the fear in my eyes. "Good," she whispered, almost to herself. "Fear is honest. Fear is real." She pressed the blade a bit harder, drawing a thin line of blood. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it echoing in my skull. She leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear, as she whispered, "Do you want to leave?" My mind screamed yes, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. Instead, I shook my head, barely believing it myself. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. As twisted as it sounds, I was hooked, trapped in this horrifying thrill of being completely at her mercy. She pulled back, seeming pleased, and loosened the straps on my wrists and ankles. I didn't move. I was too shaken, too caught up in the rush of adrenaline and fear. She walked around me, running the tip of the knife along the back of my neck, whispering things I couldn't quite understand, words that sounded foreign, ancient, like some kind of chant or prayer. Suddenly she stopped, her voice breaking into a soft, almost tender tone. "You belong to me now. You understand that, don't you?" I nodded, barely knowing what I was agreeing to. She smiled, satisfied, and finally put the knife away. The tension broke, but I was left feeling hollow, like she'd taken something from me without my permission. She led me back upstairs where she poured another drink and acted like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just crossed some invisible line that could never be uncrossed. The rest of the day was a blur. We barely spoke, but I could feel her watching me, studying my reactions, testing me in ways that didn't make sense. She'd touch my hand, trace her fingers over the cut she'd made on my arm, and smile this cold, knowing smile. That night, she insisted I stay over again. I should have said no, should have walked out right then, but I was too wrapped up in her to think straight. She fell asleep beside me, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, I felt this crushing weight on my chest, this gnawing sense that I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't escape. At some point in the night, I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a sharp, searing pain in my side. I gasped, reaching down, and felt something warm and wet against my skin. My hand came away sticky with blood, and I looked over to see her staring down at me, holding the knife. Her face was blank, void of any emotion, like she was sleepwalking, yet fully aware of what she was doing. She tilted her head, watching me with this eerie fascination as the blood seeped through my shirt. "I had to," she whispered, almost apologetic. "I just had to." I tried to move, to get away, but she pressed a finger to my lips, silencing me. "Shh," she cooed, her voice soft, almost gentle. "It's all right, it's just a little pain. You'll understand soon." And then, without another word, she rolled over and went back to sleep, leaving me there, bleeding, terrified, and more trapped than I'd ever felt in my life. I lay there, clutching my side, feeling the warmth of the blood soaking through my shirt, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my body felt frozen, like if I even breathed too hard, I'd set her off again. Every cell in my body screamed to get up, to get out of there, but fear rooted me in place, trapping me beside her. I kept staring at her face, at the peaceful, almost angelic expression as she slept, the knife still lying on the bed between us. When the first hint of dawn finally crept through the curtains, I forced myself up, moving as quietly as possible. She didn't stir, didn't even flinch when I gingerly climbed off the bed, my hand pressed tight against the wound on my side. It wasn't deep, but it hurt enough to make my head spin, enough to remind me just how close I'd come to something much worse. I stumbled into the bathroom and lifted my shirt, wincing as I saw the thin red gash stretching across my side. It wasn't fatal, but it was deep enough to leave a scar, a reminder of what I'd let myself get pulled into. I rinsed it off, biting back a hiss as the cold water hit, and wrapped myself up in some gauze I found in the medicine cabinet. As I was finishing up, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, pale, exhausted, and covered in small bruises and scratches I hadn't even noticed until then. I looked like a stranger, someone broken, someone who'd been shattered piece by piece. I had to get out of there. I slipped out of the bathroom, every step measured, every movement calculated so I wouldn't wake her. But when I reached the living room, I froze. She was already there, standing by the door, watching me, with that same unsettling smile, like she knew exactly what I'd been planning. "Leaving already?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm, like we hadn't just spent the night in a nightmare. She tilted her head, her gaze shifting to the bloodstain on my shirt, and her smile widened. "You didn't tell me goodbye." I stammered out some excuse, something about work or an appointment, but she just laughed softly, that dark, low chuckle that made my skin crawl. "I thought you understood," she whispered, stepping closer, her fingers brushing against my arm, sending a chill down my spine. Once you're mine, you're mine. You don't just get to walk away. Her words settled over me like a heavy weight, and I felt my throat tighten, my body tense. She reached up, cupping my face in her hands, her eyes boring into mine with that strange, almost hungry look. "You said you weren't afraid," she murmured, her thumb tracing over my cheek. "Don't make me think you're a liar." In that moment, I realized that leaving wasn't an option, not in the way I'd thought. She had this grip on me, this invisible chain, and as much as I wanted to break free, part of me couldn't deny that I was drawn to her, that twisted part of me that wanted to stay, to see how deep this madness could go. She let go of my face, brushing her fingers along my arm as she walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. I took a shaky breath, feeling like I'd just survived a close call, but I couldn't shake the sense that this was just the beginning. I could still feel the sting of the knife, the way she'd looked at me, so calm, so controlled, like she knew exactly what she was doing, and that it was only a matter of time before she did it again. For the next few days, I stayed with her, each moment blurring into the next, every hour weighed down by this sickening tension that never went away. She'd act normal sometimes, like we were just a regular couple. We'd eat together, talk about random things, her childhood, her strange, disjointed memories, things that didn't quite add up, but that I was too afraid to question. Then at night, she'd change, slipping into this other version of herself, darker, more unhinged. One night, she asked me to help her with something in the basement. I hesitated, but she grabbed my hand, pulling me down the stairs with a strength that didn't match her fragile frame. The basement was darker than I remembered, and she'd set up candles around the chair in the center, their flickering light casting eerie shadows across the walls. She motioned for me to sit, and when I hesitated, her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "Sit down," she said, her voice cold and flat, and I felt an icy fear settle in my stomach. I lowered myself onto the chair, and before I could react, she strapped my wrists to the arms, the leather biting into my skin. She didn't say a word, just circled me slowly, her gaze predatory, calculating. She began talking in this low, almost hypnotic voice, asking me questions, strange, uncomfortable questions that made my skin crawl. She asked about my fears, my regrets, the darkest thoughts I'd ever had, things I'd never told anyone, and the entire time she held that knife, tracing it along the edge of the chair, occasionally letting the tip graze my skin, just enough to send a shiver through me. "Do you trust me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. Every instinct told me to say no, to fight, to get out of there, but I was paralyzed, caught in this horrifying trance she'd woven around me. So I nodded, feeling a wave of nausea as the lie left my lips. She smiled, that cold, eerie smile, and leaned down, her face inches from mine. "Good," she murmured, pressing the knife against my chest, just hard enough that I could feel its edge bite into my skin. Because trust is everything. Without trust, there's nothing, just emptiness. She kept me there for hours, playing her sick games, asking questions, pushing boundaries. By the time she finally let me go, my body was covered in thin, stinging cuts and my mind was numb, hollowed out by the relentless, unending horror of it all. She watched me as I stumbled back upstairs, her expression unreadable, like she was waiting for something, some reaction that I couldn't give. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, every nerve on edge, she whispered something that chilled me to the bone. "I know you're thinking about leaving," she said softly, her fingers tracing along my arm. "But you won't. You can't. Because if you do, well, let's just say I wouldn't take it well." Her words were a threat, plain and simple, but the way she said it, so calm, so casual, made it clear that she wasn't bluffing. I was trapped, caught in this twisted game, bound to her by fear and the sick, inexplicable attraction that kept me coming back, kept me lying beside her night after night, waiting for the next horror she'd unleash. And the worst part was, I knew deep down that I didn't have the strength to leave. Not anymore. She'd broken me, hollowed me out, and now I was just hers. By now, reality had blurred into something twisted, surreal. Days turned into a fog, nights were nightmares I couldn't wake up from. And Evelyn? She was always there, her presence haunting every corner of my mind. I'd stopped trying to pretend that I could just walk away. I was too far gone, too tangled up in her darkness to see any way out. And maybe, just maybe, I'd started to accept it. Maybe I thought this was what I deserved. One night, things took a turn. She'd been quiet all day, barely speaking, just watching me with this strange look, like she was measuring something, calculating. I kept my distance, knowing better than to push her when she was in one of her moods. But as the night crept in, she called me over to the basement door, her voice low, controlled. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. But her eyes, that hollow, intense stare, pinned me in place. She gestured for me to follow her down the stairs, and I felt this icy dread settle over me as I descended into that familiar, suffocating darkness. The basement was different this time. The candles were gone, and in their place was a single, dim light casting long shadows that danced across the walls. In the center of the room, something new caught my eye, a large, heavy trunk. It looked old, worn, the wood splintered and stained. There was something about it, something that made my skin crawl just looking at it. Evelyn stood beside it, her hands resting on the lid, her fingers drumming against the wood. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared down at the trunk with this strange, almost reverent expression. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "Do you want to see what's inside?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I didn't want to see. Every fiber of my being screamed that whatever was in that trunk was something I was better off not knowing. But I nodded, unable to form the words to refuse her. She slowly lifted the lid, and a wave of cold air escaped, filling the room with a foul, metallic smell that hit me like a punch to the gut. My eyes watered, and I took a step back, instinctively covering my nose, but she grabbed my wrist, her grip iron tight, pulling me closer, forcing me to look inside. What I saw made my stomach turn. The trunk was lined with old, faded cloth, stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. And scattered inside were items, personal things, watches, wallets, pieces of jewelry, things that had once belonged to people who'd never left. "These are my treasures," she whispered, her voice soft, almost affectionate. She ran her fingers over a small, tarnished ring, her gaze distant, lost in some dark memory. Each one special, each one earned. I felt the bile rise in my throat as the reality of what she was saying sank in. She'd kept these things as trophies, twisted reminders of the people who'd been here before me, who'd sat in that chair, who'd felt the bite of her knife, just like I had. Only they hadn't left, they hadn't survived. I pulled back, panic clawing at my chest, but she held onto my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "You're different," she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine. They didn't understand, but you get it, don't you? You're not like them." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I forced myself to nod, my mind scrambling to process the horror unraveling around me. I knew I had to play along, to say whatever she needed to hear, because one wrong move, one wrong word, and I knew I'd end up like them, just another treasure in her sick collection. She let go of my arm, her gaze softening as she took a step back, studying me with that unsettling smile. "I knew you'd understand," she whispered, almost to herself. "I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for." The way she said it with such calm certainty made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, bound to her by fear, by the twisted power she held over me. She closed the trunk, locking it with a key. She slipped back around her neck and motioned for me to follow her upstairs. I staggered behind her, every step feeling heavier than the last, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape, to break free of this nightmare before it consumed me completely. But as we reached the top of the stairs, she turned to me, her gaze sharp, knowing. "Don't even think about it," she said softly, her voice cold, like a blade pressed against my skin. "If you try to leave, you'll regret it. And trust me, I'll make sure it hurts." Her words settled over me like a shroud, sealing my fate, and I felt my last bit of hope slip away. I was hers, bound to her in ways I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I nodded, forcing myself to meet her gaze, to show her the submission she craved. She smiled, satisfied, and led me to the bedroom, her hand resting possessively on my shoulder. That night I lay beside her, my body rigid, my mind racing with plans, desperate, frantic plans that seemed more hopeless with each passing moment. I knew I had to act, to find some way out, but every option felt like a dead end, a path leading straight back to her. And the worst part was, some sick, twisted part of me didn't want to leave, didn't want to let go of the dark, terrifying thrill she'd woven around me. As I drifted into a restless sleep, her voice echoed in my mind, that soft, chilling whisper. "You're mine, forever." And for the first time, I truly believed it. The next morning, I woke up alone. For a moment, I felt a strange relief, a fleeting sense that maybe she was gone, that maybe this was over. But then I heard her humming from the kitchen, this soft, haunting melody that sent chills through me. I didn't know what the tune was, but it felt familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. I pulled myself together, moving slowly, every muscle sore and aching from the past few days. My side throbbed where she'd cut me that first night, the skin raw and sensitive. I made my way to the kitchen, forcing myself to act normal, to pretend like I wasn't suffocating under the weight of her control. She looked up as I entered, giving me that smile that was both sweet and deadly. "Good morning," she said softly, setting a plate of toast and eggs in front of me. It was normal, painfully so, and I almost wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Here I was, eating breakfast with a woman who had just shown me her collection of treasures from people who'd never left her clutches. But I didn't laugh. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, eating slowly, keeping my gaze down, knowing she was watching my every move, every twitch of my face. She didn't say much, just watched, a strange calmness about her that put me even more on edge. It was like she was waiting for something, a shift in the air, a signal. After breakfast, she reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. Her fingers were cold, her grip firm, and she leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "I have something special planned for us today." I swallowed, feeling my pulse quicken. There was no point in asking what it was. I already knew it was something I wouldn't want to hear, but I forced a smile, nodding, playing along like I always did, like I had to. She led me to the bedroom, motioning for me to sit on the edge of the bed. Her face was serious, intense, her gaze locked onto mine in a way that made me feel like I was shrinking under her scrutiny. She pulled out the knife again, holding it up between us, the blade catching the light, gleaming in that familiar, sinister way. "Today's the day," she murmured, her voice laced with excitement, almost reverence. The day you truly become mine. I didn't understand what she meant, but every fiber of my being screamed that this was it, that whatever was about to happen would be the end of the line, the point of no return. She took a step closer, holding the knife up to my face, tracing the flat of the blade along my cheek, her touch both tender and terrifying. "I need you to show me," she whispered, her eyes boring into mine. "Show me that you're willing to go as far as I need you to, that you'll do anything for me." I tried to pull back, but she pressed the knife closer, the tip grazing my skin just enough to make me freeze. Her gaze didn't waver, her expression expectant, waiting. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, metallic, a lighter. She flicked it open, the tiny flame casting a warm glow that felt out of place in that cold, oppressive room. "Hold out your hand," she commanded, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. I hesitated, my mind screaming to refuse, to fight, to get away. But her expression darkened, her grip tightening on the knife, and I knew she wouldn't take no for an answer. Slowly, reluctantly, I held out my hand, my fingers trembling as she brought the flame closer, lowering it until the heat prickled my skin, making me grit my teeth against the pain. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice low and commanding, and I felt the flame sear into my skin, the sharp, unbearable burn shooting up my arm, making me gasp. She watched me, her gaze intense, her smile widening as she saw the pain in my eyes, saw the way I bit down on the scream clawing its way up my throat. "Good," she murmured, pulling the lighter away, her thumb brushing over the fresh burn, pressing down just enough to send another wave of agony through me. Pain is truth. Pain is love. I wanted to pull back, to run, but I was trapped, bound by her gaze, by the twisted power she held over me. She dropped the lighter and took the knife again, pressing it into my hand, curling my fingers around the handle, forcing me to grip it tight. "Now it's your turn," she whispered, guiding my hand up, pressing the blade against her own skin, against her arm. "Show me." I froze, the weight of the knife heavy in my hand, my mind reeling, my body locked in place. She leaned closer, her voice soft, coaxing. "Do it! Show me that you're mine, that you'll do anything for me." I felt my hand start to shake, my grip loosening, but she tightened her hold, forcing my hand to press the blade harder against her skin. Blood beaded along the edge, a thin red line, and she gasped softly, her eyes closing, her expression one of sick, twisted ecstasy. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling with a strange, terrifying excitement. "Keep going." I couldn't do it. My hand went limp, the knife slipping from my fingers, clattering to the floor. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment there was something in her gaze, anger, disappointment, something dark and dangerous that made my blood run cold. "You're weak," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain, "just like the others." She grabbed the knife, her grip tight, her knuckles white, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me, knowing that I'd crossed a line, that I'd failed her in some unspoken, unforgivable way. She raised the blade, her gaze locked onto mine, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought she was going to kill me, right then and there. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled, a cold, chilling smile, and leaned down, her lips brushing against my ear, as she whispered, "You're not worth it." Then she turned, leaving me there, broken, bleeding, a hollow shell of the person I'd once been. I sat there, numb, staring at the blood on my hand, the burn on my palm, feeling nothing but a cold, empty void where my fear, my hope, my humanity had once been. And as I listened to her footsteps fade away, I knew that I'd lost something I'd never get back. I'd become a part of her darkness, a fragment of her twisted world, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be free. She had claimed me, body and soul, and I knew deep down that I'd never truly escape.